Welcome back to Tumbleweed Radio. I'm Connor Orr. I've always been enchanted by the wilderness of the Spanish Peaks. Growing up, I was incredibly lucky to be able to spend a lot of time outdoors in the mountains. So many of my favorite memories from when I was a child are from the times when my family and I would go hiking and camping in the area surrounding the East Peak. Those were such simple days. And man, was it easy to use my imagination back then. It seems like for a number of years, practically all that my siblings and I did was run around with sticks and act like characters from the Lord of the Rings. We would fight thistles with sticks, fight each other with sticks, and build houses and boats from sticks for the fairies who live by the creek. These mountains are the perfect place for an active imagination. Plus, and I have this on very good authority, we have the best sticks around. The foothills roll out from the peaks like ripples on a pond, with a thick blanket of green broken up by fields, rivers, and valleys. There are dikes, enormous stone walls all across the landscape, which everyone just takes for granted, and they are like the ruins of old castles, but were formed by no human hand. These walls formed beneath the earth as magma cooled in tremendous cracks, and it has taken many millennia for the earth around to erode away and reveal these impressive features. The mountains themselves resemble the spine of some unbelievable beast, or perhaps the body of a sleeping giant. Their rocky crests are somehow both supple and jagged, and their sides are covered in dense, tangled forest. Up high, near treeline, there are bristlecone pine trees which have survived for hundreds of years, so indicative of movement, so bent, swirled into fantastic shapes over the long course of their lives. These trees almost feel like they could be sentient. You know, a lot has changed since I was a kid, but this landscape still inspires my imagination. So maybe I don't cut down thistles with as much enthusiasm as when I was young enough to see them as invading orcs, but I'd be lying if I said that I don't still imagine fantastic things happening around here. It's a special place. I've always felt in my heart that it's a special place. But for a while, I kind of figured that was just because I have these amazing parents who raised me to see the wonder in the world. Everyone around here likes the Spanish Peaks, but in my experience, not everyone views them through a magical lens. That's why when I first started working at the Spanish Peak Scout Ranch when I was 15, I was blown away to find a roaring community, a group of people with a decades-long tradition of total reverence, practically worship held towards the Spanish Peaks. These people love these mountains in particular, and every summer, hundreds of them come from all over the country, drawn as if tethered to the majestic Huajatolla. Shoot, half of the folks up at camp each summer will swear on a stack of Bibles that these mountains are magic, and these people are lifers, coming back year after year across the decades in order to bask in Huajatolla's presence and sing songs of its praise. It's up at the Scout Ranch that I first started to hear the stories of Louis B. Sporleder. This week, we are continuing our dive into the history of Huarfano County with an examination of a character pivotal in the process of telling legends of the Spanish Peaks. Friends, I have got to tell you, doing historical research is hard work. You see, the thing about history is that often, there's not a very clear line between fact and fiction. Unless you have hard evidence that an event happened, it's little more than hearsay. And even if you know that an event happened, how do you know that it happened the way that history tells it? As the philosopher George Santayana once probably said, history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. Well, that is certainly the case in Huarfano County, and I guess I am just taking part in a proud tradition of acting like I have any idea what I'm talking about. As it turns out, some of the most primary sources for legends pertaining to the Spanish Peaks area are the writings of just one man, Louis B. Sporleder, and he was an interesting character who may or may not be fully trustworthy. Lewis was born to German immigrants in 1857 in St. Louis, Missouri, but his father died when he was only 2. By today's standards, Lewis was a rather swashbuckling youth. When he wasn't working as an apprentice to a sword maker, he was traipsing through the surrounding countryside with his friends or studying classic works of literature and philosophy in both English and German. When he was only 16 years old, he left home and traveled across country alone to join his cousins in the village of Plaza de los Leones, which was soon to be incorporated as the town of Walsenburg in 1873. He became enamored with the countryside and set about exploring the area and chronicling its features. Over the course of his life, Lewis intensively studied the history and geography of the Spanish Peaks region, gathering stories from locals and old-timers and recording them for publication with photographs and several printed guides to the area. He also sometimes wrote for the local newspaper, and his writings therein often resembled poetry more than journalism. And now the day once more is done. The shadows of twilight are shrouding the deeper ravines in darkness, and only from the pinnacle of the great silent mountain a splendor of golden rays shoots. He became acquainted with several Native Americans as a young adult. Members of the Ute tribe were still commonly found around here in those days, and his experiences with them sparked a lifelong interest in the ways of life that existed on this continent before Europeans arrived. He claims to have heard several of the local tribe's legends, and later wrote on those legends extensively in his works for the paper and guidebooks. It is likely that he embellished a few details here and there, and he may have outright made some things up. It is difficult to tell. He certainly had a powerful imagination, and he was a folk historian, to be sure. The passage of time has obfuscated many of the details which we now need to verify his stories. Unfortunately, he was not a great citer of his sources. Honestly, while reading works from and about Mr. Sporleder, I'm reminded of the dual moniker of the ancient Greek writer Herodotus, the father of history and the father of lies. Another thing to consider about Lewis is that he may have had ulterior motives for telling the stories that he told. As a prominent businessman in a young city, it was in his financial best interest to tell stories that would attract more settlers to Walsenburg. As the local historian and reporter for the World Journal Nancy Christopherson described him in an article about the legends of the Spanish Peaks, Louis B. was a one-man walking chamber of commerce, recording history, spinning yarns, and quoting statistics that all pointed the traveler to the fertility of the land, the annual rainfall, the temperate climate, and mineral riches in the hope that they too would settle in the Spanish Peaks country. So we've got to take his writings with a grain of salt. But personally, I don't find the self-interested marketing man explanation very satisfying. Earlier this year, I was able to go check out some of his old writings, paperwork, and correspondence in the Western History Archive of the Denver Public Library, and there are pages and pages of meditations and poetic musings about the Spanish Peaks there. These aren't the writings of a shrewd businessman. These are the writings of a very spiritual man with a deep love for two mountains in particular. And besides, whatever their origin, whatever the purpose behind their creation, it is clear that these stories have officially met the standards for being real, legitimate legends. They have spread and evolved, and while they used to be greatly important to this area, today they have been largely forgotten about and are mostly referenced by locals only with regard to the branding of the local golf club. My generation especially has little to no knowledge of the rich history that exists about our mountain. Like I said, the first time I ever really heard Louis' stories was at the Spanish Peak Scout Ranch, which is run out of Kansas. Now, Kansas, baby, you know I love you. But it is wild to me that there might be a bunch of y'all who know the legends of these parts better than half of our locals. That's just not right. I've got to fix it. So I've decided to use this podcast to tell some of those stories. Now, I'm not going to totally swivel the whole show on you again. I promised you people that I'd talk about the Colorado Coalfield War. And I will, in good time. But I'm also going to talk about legends and stuff from time to time. Other things too, probably. Hey, give me a break. The show is called Tumbleweed Radio. You don't expect consistency from tumbleweeds. Now and then, an episode will roll across your feed, and you can either be grateful for the cool experience or swerve to hit it with your car. But you can't expect consistency. Every tumbleweed is different, like fingerprints or gas station burritos. Anyway, later this week, I'll tell you the infamous tale of El Grandote, one of the most vivid but brutal stories that Lewis told. But for now, I just want to linger for a little bit longer on the man himself. In my opinion, Louis Sporleder was a man well worthy of our attention in his own right. His philosophy is a good one, and it has a great deal to say about how to move forward in this life of increasing complexity. Then again, I would say that. I've got a strong bit of bias in the telling of this tale. I've been holding something back from you, listener. Over the course of his life, Louis B. Sporleder went on to become Louis B. Sporleder Sr., and one of his children went on to grow up and have a few kids of their own. And long story short, bing bada boom, Louis B. was my great-great-grandfather. What's that? Huh? Oh, I've got too much bias to tell this story? Ah, shoot. Well, I don't see anyone around here to stop me. Listen, I am going to do my best to represent this guy fairly. True, I have been raised with stories about him. I love the legends about this area which he told, and I am of his stock. But to be honest, after digging into his writings, I'm not entirely sure that we would have gotten along. I mean, I hope we would. By all indications, he was an intelligent and fascinating individual, a philosopher, and a man of many talents. But at least in his later years, he seemed to have become a bit embittered, estranged from an increasingly modern society. It's hard to imagine that he would have been pleased by the complexity of today's world, and I shudder to think what he would imagine of all the people who have been shaped by it. He was a man of a different era, and some of the evidence of that fact is a little disturbing. Some of the observations that he made appear to have been rooted in generalized and rather ugly notions of race. That's not to say that he appears to have been an outright racist, but he was certainly a proponent of the noble savage caricature of indigenous Americans. Plus, he was a bit uptight. I mean, come on. The man didn't even like jazz. Nevertheless, my family has always painted a romantic picture of him, and I'll confess to having always felt a certain kinship between us. He was this eccentric outdoorsman who wandered all across the mountain, having adventures all the way. Over the course of his life, he found petroglyphs, prayer sites, even an old Spanish sword. His life was rich with stories. Besides his published works, there are those which he spoke of only with his close friends and family, and they range from believable to outrageous. Among other things, he claimed to have befriended a fairy named Firefly, who took him on fantastic journeys. Reportedly, they even traveled together regularly to Valhalla, perhaps to share a few beers with Viking warriors of old. These are the stories which are now hardest to find evidence of. Louis was a public-facing guy, and he was aware of how it would look if he was always going on about fairies and drunken nights in ancient Norse beer halls. In a letter to his friend Rose in 1938, he wrote that, "During my long life, I've had so many queer things of an exceptional nature happen to me that I am almost afraid to tell much about these things of fear that people will call me, if nothing worse, nutty or crazy. While I was active in business, I had to be very careful in my utterances. You know how easily a businessman's credit can be impaired if his reputation of sanity suffers. Now, of course, it is different. My days in business are things of the past, and I can say what I please. Still, there are certain limits. I would hate to pose as a nut or an eccentric." What kind of things did he experience? And what plants did he eat up there? Whatever was going on, it is clear that Louis B. was a dreamer. He admitted as much in a letter to his niece Frida Renshaw in 1930, saying, "Although a dreamer, I possess a practical streak too. I am a liberal. even a little radical in some of my views, except in affairs of finance and property rights. There you may count me along with the most conservative. Altogether different is my intellectual life, and, I may add, my spiritual life. In it I have no horizon. I roam beyond all bounds, but I am well aware of the fact that often I seek what is unattainable. He seemed to be seeking answers to the greatest of questions, writing in letters to his friends about matters of God, dogma, death, and rebirth. He dreamt of a better society, one in which mankind lived harmoniously with nature. And what's more, he believed that that society was possible, and thought that when it was achieved, Huajatolla would once again be heralded and widely acclaimed for their obvious and unparalleled beauty. From his booklet Huajatolla, Colorado's Mystic Mountain, to close us out. To toil and to work forever is not man's highest condition. Even if it is now maintained that idleness is an evil, or that it produces evil, the day is not far distant when men will again deny this. A future generation with an advanced circle of ideas will acknowledge that idleness is a great good, a great blessing. And the time will come when all men will be free to enjoy this beautiful world. Someday men will work for the soul more than they do now for bread. Succeeding generations will be able to be idle in the perfection of the physical frames, in the expansion of the mind, in the enlargement of the spirit. Man will find his scope, his range of action. And Huajatolla, the mystic double mountain, endowed by God with more than the ordinary qualities which contribute to the pleasure of man, will again be sought as a place of refuge by those who have obtained the wider view of being and long for the fuller and larger soul life. Thanks for listening to Tumbleweed Radio, folks. It's pretty clear by now that you have obtained the wider view of being and long for more audio content about the beautiful Rocky Mountain Southwest. Well, not to worry. I've got another episode up my sleeve. So stay tuned for the story of Grandote, coming to a computer near you later this week. Coming to a computer near you.